Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for a very topical discussion about cybersecurity. The focus will be to review the key findings from the recently published X-Force report, which provides insights about cybersecurity trends with the aim of keeping security professionals aware of the most pressing and imminent threats. My name is Roger Osmond, and I am the General Manager for the R2I Ontario Division, and will be your host today. I have spent over 35 years in the IT industry, the first 15 at IBM, and then in various sales and business leadership roles within Canadian solution providers, including the last year and a half here at R2I. Joining me today from IBM as our featured presenter is Michelle Alvarez. Michelle is the manager of the Threat Intelligence Production Team within the IBM Security X-Force. She brings nearly 20 years of cybersecurity to her role, specializing in threat research and communication. In her current role, she focuses communication efforts around strategic threat and impact assessments for X-Force incident response and threat intelligence clients. Michelle's previous roles include threat analyst, writer, and manager with IBM Managed Security Services. And welcome to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Roger. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So following my short introduction of R2I, Michelle will update us on the trends shaping the threat landscape to assess risk and refine your security strategy. We will also learn about the new destructive malware being used in cyber attacks in Ukraine. She will also explain how to enhance your vulnerability management with a zero trust strategy, and how to detect blind spots to accelerate and automate security responses for hybrid cloud environments. I'll then conclude with some useful next steps that we can work together on, and we'll open it up then for questions and discussion. Though saying we can hold questions till the end, we certainly can, but if you have a question throughout the presentation, please leave it in the chat and we'll see if we can address it live during the presentation as well. With that, let's get going. So R2I, I know many of you do know R2I, but perhaps we are new to some of you. So R2I, the R in R2I stands for resources and speaks to the highly skilled technical sales and technical professionals within R2I that have on average over 25 years or more of experience. The two I's stand for infrastructure and integration. Infrastructure being our traditional strength and focus, and integration, meaning the integration of our clients into our various managed services, as well as our R2I public and private cloud offerings. So who is R2I? R2I was founded in Montreal in 2014 and has grown to over 40 employees with offices in Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. R2I has been recognized as one of Canada's fastest growing IT companies for the last 4 years, and our success has been rewarded with multiple business and technology awards from organizations and associations across the country. We are exceptionally proud of our 4 R2I cloud data centers, all of which are SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, and these support our public and hybrid cloud offerings. We have 2 in the Montreal area that are synchronous to one another, and 2 more in the Greater Toronto area, synchronous to themselves and asynchronously connected to our Montreal data centers. We are also a leader in ISO compliancy, and we have certifications in ISO 27001, 27017, and 27018. And that supports our IBM cloud and on-prem managed services. And these are supported through our 724, 365 Montreal-based network operations center, all with our Canadian employees. So really about us, we specialize in data center IT infrastructure, cloud computing, digital transformation, artificial intelligence, and IT managed services. Our historical IT infrastructure focus includes servers, storage and networking, virtualized, hyper-converged disaster recovery, and high availability solutions, just to name a few. We help clients move to public, private, and hybrid clouds. We help them modernize and transform their applications and move them along in a journey towards harnessing artificial intelligence to optimize their businesses. Our consulting services, our 724 managed services, and our cloud offerings are all Canadian-based and supported by our team of highly experienced and skilled technical professionals. And of course, we partner with the premier solution providers in the industry, of course, including IBM, of which we hold the coveted platinum partner status, only one of a very small number to do so in the country. And with that short introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Michelle, and we'll take a look at the findings of the X-Force report. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Roger. And thank you for that great introduction earlier. So, in terms of my current role, manager of the threat intel team within IBM Security X-Force, our main responsibility is to research, assess, and communicate the cyber threat landscape to our clients as well as others. Everything from the most notable threat actors, whether it's nation state or cyber criminal, how are they getting into the networks? What are they doing once they're in there? And then based on that research and findings, what are the best practices or risk mitigations that we can provide to clients and others in the industry? One of the ways that we communicate the threat landscape is through our annual Threat Intelligence Index, which, as Roger noted, will be the basis for our focus of discussion today. So next slide. And we've been delivering this report now for over a decade. It details the threat landscape, and it's designed to help both public and private organizations, as well as the broader intelligence industry, to learn about the cyber threats and how we can best mitigate them. So we draw on billions of data points. This is everything from network and endpoint detection devices that we monitor globally to incident response engagement. So basically those that are boots on the ground responding to the incidents at our client sites around the world. Every year that this report comes out, of course, we share the findings. What's different about the report this year is the timing, or what happened post-publication. So on February 23rd, we published the report, and then the next day on the February 24th, Russia launched a large-scale invasion against Ukraine. Understandably so, we've had many inquiries about what we're seeing or what we know in terms of the cyber threat landscape or the potential impact from this invasion on the cyber threat landscape. So I've incorporated a few key takeaways from what we understand about the threat landscape with regards to the war. I do want to note, though we have a comprehensive virtual brief that we're offering free. And with this brief, the subject matter experts on Russian sponsored state groups provide a more comprehensive and in detail briefing in terms of what we know, what we've seen since the invasion, and what we can potentially expect based on historical targeting and objectives of these groups. So it's a very interesting brief. So I do recommend, if you're interested, please reach out to your IBM representative, and we're happy to set that up for you. And then, of course, I'll proceed to what are the findings in the report, as noted. We'll cover what we've observed in 2021, but of course, we're now in May of this year. So where possible, I'll share some insights into what we've seen up until now. And then, of course, I'll wrap up with some recommendations that we also provided in the report. And as Roger noted, don't hesitate to post your questions in the chat as well as we go along. Next slide. All right, so in terms of what we're seeing in terms of cyber threats as it relates to the war in Ukraine, there's definitely been a lot of activity, both pro-Russian as well as pro-Ukrainian actors, as well as observed activity from hacktivists and cyber criminal groups. One of the main things that we're stressing at this time is that the vast majority of activity that is suspected to be carried out by either Russian state-sponsored actors or those sympathetic to Russia has been undertaken against entities in Ukraine itself. And this is going to include the most recent notable incident, which occurred in April. It was a foiled cyber attack against Ukraine's electric grid. There was a new industrial control system malware that was used called and WEBIN'R2I, as well as a wiper malware. In fact, we've seen a number of wiper malwares or destructive malwares used against Ukrainian entities since the invasion began. That said, we're of course monitoring for evidence that Russia-directed or sympathetic actors are expanding their scope. It's very plausible that they could expand their scope beyond entities in Ukraine, especially given the number of international government warnings regarding threat to critical infrastructure. There's of course also the risk that an attack on a critical utility or other vendor could result in additional organizations becoming what's known as collateral damage. So basically, the organizations that are impacted down the line due to an incident. For example, there was a destructive attack against a satellite company called Viasat at the beginning of the invasion. It of course impacted a large number of customers in Ukraine, but it also impacted their ability to continue operations in other parts of Europe. So aside from these types of attacks, we've also seen what we consider sort of low-level attacks, website defacements, distributed denial of service attacks, as well as phishing campaigns. There have been multiple groups driven by their ideology that have declared allegiance to one side or the other in the conflict. A prominent example is Anonymous. This is a hacktivist group, and they've actually declared the intentions to not just target entities in Russia, but also businesses that are conducting or organizations that are conducting business in Russia. We're also, of course, tracking the cyber criminal groups that have stated their intentions to support Russia. So the flip side, right? And we've seen this with a group known as Conti, and this is a specific ransomware group. Then, of course, there's the opportunistic groups that are likely going to take advantage and have been taking advantage of the diverted attention. They use the theme of the conflict to, of course, further their interests, whether it's theft, fraud, or extortion. Given all of this, we definitely recommend that every client sort of assess their individual threat profile. Sectors that are historically targets of Russian state-sponsored activity, and especially those in sectors that have been highlighted by government warnings. That's going to be energy, healthcare, as well as the financial sectors. So these industries or organizations within these industries should definitely examine their overall defensive posture as it relates to Russian threats specifically. The threat from their cyber program is absolutely credible. So for entities that fall outside of this targeting profile, the threats from hacktivists and cyber criminal actors, as I mentioned, also very likely to be heightened as long as the conflict continues. So again, just organizations should maintain their overall existing threat models while recognizing that the heightened security awareness during this time is definitely advisable. So I'll pause for a minute just in case any questions have rolled in. But again, I want to mention that we are offering a very comprehensive brief on this particular topic at this time.
I don't see any questions. I don't see any posted questions at this time, Michelle.
Okay, perfect. So let's move right into the report findings. Next slide, and we'll start with the top attacks we saw in 2021. So no surprise for us anyway that ransomware was yet again the top attack type, and this is for the third year in a row. It made up 21%, or 1 in 5 attacks that our incident response teams were engaged in for last year. Of a small note, this is actually slightly less than the previous year. So ransomware actually made up 23% of attacks in 2020. And so we think this slight dip is basically a side effect of increased law enforcement, as several ransomware groups actually went dark or rebranded to avoid arrests last year. We anticipate, however, that these criminals, they'll be back and more cyber criminals will actually gravitate to this attack. Therefore, of course, requiring more law enforcement in an attempt to take them down. Another interesting finding from our research here is that the majority of ransomware attacks where we were engaged actually stemmed from the Rebel ransomware group. So this is actually a second year in a row where they were the top ransomware strain. Many may remember the supply chain attack against Kaseya last year. That was actually the group that launched that major supply chain attack. They leveraged a zero-day vulnerability. There appeared to be some good news last year in October where it looked like they had shut down for good, but we're actually starting to see reportings of their return. So again, what we often find, attackers have sort of this life cycle, and this is exactly another finding that we saw in our research was that the average lifespan of a ransomware group is 17 months, or just about a year and a half before the group shuts down or rebrands. So this includes the cycle of the group springing up, conducting their attacks, cashing in, and then finally getting out of the operation, perhaps again due to the pressure from law enforcement. In terms of what we anticipate for this year, well, in terms of incidents that we've seen in Q1, we definitely still see it fairly prolific across our engagements. In terms of what we expect maybe for top ransomware strain, it could very well end up being a net new strain from one of the groups that rises from the ashes, if you will, from these disbanded groups. We've seen quite a bit of Conti ransomware, and as I mentioned, this group has declared that they will be targeting Ukrainian entities. So because of the conflict, there could be an impact to the overall number. So it's hard to tell right now. It's not quite halfway through the year, and oftentimes we do see significant changes in the second half of the year in terms of trends. And then one final note on ransomware, since it is very prevalent, and to discuss a little bit about why it's so popular with attackers. It's not just about the ransomware. Attackers are using what's called double extortion. This is a combination of not just encrypting the data, but they're also exfiltrating the data and then threatening to leak the data. So in the event that organizations they're able to decrypt the data, this is putting added pressure on organizations to pay the ransom. And in fact, in all of or almost every ransomware engagement that we've been involved in since 2019 has involved this double extortion tactic. So extremely popular with ransomware groups because it's been paying off for them. There are occasions where we've been seeing triple extortion. So again, using the tactic of double extortion plus the threat of distributed denial of service. So it's not something we're seeing as often, but it is being used at some level. So breaking away from ransomware for a second, do want to talk about the second attack type that's noted here. It's server access attacks, and it made up 11% of all incidents. These attacks involve where we know the attacker gained unauthorized access to a system or a server, but the final end goal is not known. Many were potentially failed ransomware incidents or attempts. So again, they got in, they got access, but the attack was potentially mitigated before the end goal or operations took place. Then I do want to note, of course, business email compromise. It's in third place there. And it's interesting because we actually saw a downturn in this type of attack the year prior, and now they're back up. We're attributing this to a lot of organizations in Latin America being targeted and organizations where multi-factor authentication is not enabled. And I'll actually talk a little bit about that or elaborate in the recommendations section of the talk. Then there are a few others that make up the top attacks, but we mostly get asked about the other category because it is a bit of an optical illusion here. It looks like it encompasses way more than the rest, but each of the subcategories within the other category actually makes up a much more smaller percentage. So for instance, we've got misconfiguration, remote access Trojan, malicious insider. So it consists of a number of different attacks that we investigate. The malicious insider, remote access Trojan, and misconfiguration, those are some of our top attacks, whereas the other consists of crypto miners, defacements, point of sale malware, etc. So, we focus on the top threats or attack types, and a lot of the subcategories in the other are something smaller than 1%. So next slide, unless there's any questions specifically on attack types. Moving into infection vectors. Of course, this is how attackers are getting into the environment. And throughout the year, both phishing and vulnerability exploitation were sort of neck and neck, with vulnerability exploitation actually being seen more in Q3. But cumulatively, there were more compromises via phishing. So I'll emphasize that these vectors both are very important to mitigate. In terms of phishing, something to keep in mind, especially when educating your user base, is that we saw phishing, which is phishing via a phone call or voicemail, has been especially effective. So when we saw targeted phishing campaigns that added phone calls to their social engineering, it was actually 3 times as effective to get the victim to either click on a link in an email or reveal information over the phone. So what we have here is basically attackers applying this marketing 101 to their operations. If I'm marketing a product, I know that the more touch points I have with the consumer, the more likely I'll be successful at getting the consumer to buy my product or service. So the same goes for attackers and their phishing operations. They'll have more success if there are multiple touch points in their campaign. And this twofold attack really captures the importance of addressing cybersecurity, and especially in phishing, from both a solution, a software solution, as well as the human perspective, right? So software perspective, implementing an email security solution that's going to filter out the malicious messages, but also have the end user training be very specific along the lines of what we're seeing currently as it relates to phishing campaigns. So the use of phishing and phone calls. And then also maybe including a pen tester to address those gaps. And then on the vulnerability front, so despite coming in second, we actually saw a 33% increase in attacks year over year through the successful exploitation of vulnerabilities. In particular, we saw significant exploitation of the Apache Log4j vulnerability, which was actually number 2 on our list of most exploited vulnerabilities for last year, despite it not coming out till December. A Microsoft proxy or Microsoft Exchange proxy vulnerability was actually in first place. And in fact, another or different vulnerability impacting Microsoft Exchange was in third. So threat actors really going after Microsoft Exchange Server last year. The oldest vulnerability in our top 10 list for 2021 actually had been disclosed 4 years earlier, which seems like a very old vulnerability to be exploiting, but actually in the year prior, we saw several CVEs that were in the top 10 list that had been disclosed for nearly a decade or more. So what we think happened last year is that there were several vulnerabilities that were easily exploited and found in widespread applications and platforms such as Apache and Microsoft Exchange Server. So again, attackers just taking advantage of that window of opportunity before organizations actually patch. And what do we expect for this year? Well, every year we see a mixed bag of new vulnerabilities and older vulnerabilities being exploited. I anticipate another prolific vulnerability like Log4j to probably surface this year. And these vulnerabilities tend to sort of linger in terms of attackers leveraging them for exploitation. To give another example, there was a very notable vulnerability in Citrix server that came out, I believe, December of 2019. So it made our top 10 list. In fact, it was #1 in 2020 as most exploited. And then in this year's report for 2021, it actually rounded out our top 10, so at the 10th spot. So definitely phishing and vulnerability exploitation, two infection vectors that organizations definitely want to look to mitigate. Next slide. So in terms of threats to supply chain, I want to talk a little bit just briefly about the threats against operational technology, Internet of Things, manufacturing, and supply chain in general. This is because manufacturing did emerge as the #1 attacked industry last year. It edged out finance and insurance for the first time in 5 years, which really just highlights or emphasizes the fact that attackers are going after the supply chain and organizations whose disruptions can lead to ripple effects across many industries. So out of OT connected organizations where X-Force observed attacks in 2021, 61% were against manufacturing organizations. So again, just underscores how closely tied the threat to manufacturing is to operational technology in general. Related to this, we saw an over 2,200 increase in reconnaissance against SCADA Modbus devices that were open to the internet. We also saw quite a bit of botnet activity directed at IoT devices, and 74% or 3/4 of that activity we can attribute to the Mosey botnet. So as with ransomware, we're really hoping that similar efforts by law enforcement, which we also have seen against IoT botnets, have an impact on this overall trend in a positive way. But the main point here is that threat actors really recognize the delicate balance of the supply chain. So from manufacturers to wholesalers to consumers, and the involvement of the transportation infrastructure in all of this, and basically how easy it is to target and how they can capitalize and monetize the pressure that stems from organizations within this chain that want to avoid disruption. We definitely anticipate more of the same this year, especially with supply chain challenges continuing in 2022. Attackers are going to continue to view the industries in this space as a favorable target. Next slide, please. In terms of threats to cloud environments and how they may impact your organization, part of the research we did here is with our partners at Intezer. It involved looking at the development of unique Linux malware. So Linux, of course, is the backbone of most cloud environments. So we looked at Linux malware that has changed year over year, and we saw a 146% increase in Linux ransomware with new code. What this means is that we're seeing a massive investment by threat actors in creating new Linux-focused malware. And this is basically across the board, right? Not just ransomware. So when we look at the chart here on the right-hand side, not only do we see increasing innovation of ransomware overall, but banking, Trojan, miner, and botnet malware, they've all spiked in terms of innovation or net new code. And what this means basically is that threat actors are looking at cloud environments as where organizations are moving to. And so, of course, they're following suit. And they're developing capabilities to target cloud environments. This is a long-term investment for them. Time, money, resources, under the expectation that there will be a return on investment. So, and of course, as we've seen with other attacks, we can anticipate that the overall bar of sophistication for attackers to get into this space will continue to decrease as expertise is shared throughout the threat actor community. Another notable observation from this research is that we're finding attackers are increasingly targeting the Docker platform or containers, which are often used, of course, in platform as a service cloud solution. Other platforms like Windows and Kubernetes, they're not immune. So we've also seen actors go after those as well. Then, of course, oftentimes we get asked the question, so what are attackers doing in the cloud once they gain access? In some cases, yes, we are seeing attackers get in, take as much data as they can, and quickly leave, sort of the classic smash and grab. However, more often, we're actually seeing attackers leverage cloud environments as a platform for longer-term malicious activity. So maybe they use it as a platform for their command and control activity or host malware. The index touches briefly on threats and recommendations for cloud environments. However, we actually publish a much more in-depth report, the Cloud Threat Landscape Report. The last report was published in September. We plan to publish another one in September. So I highly recommend reviewing that report for additional information, where we saw attackers most often pivoting their access from on-prem to cloud environments, or we go into depth about how they're taking advantage of improperly configured assets, and also, of course, they're exploiting vulnerabilities impacting the cloud. Next slide, please. All right, so moving on to geographic trends. It's pretty interesting with this year's report, as Asia came in as most targeted at 26% of the overall attacks that we observed. This is followed by Europe coming in second and North America coming in third. But while we saw some changes in the overall lineup, there really is a very small percentage difference between the top three geographies. Overall, attackers have a very diversified portfolio. In general, they're not necessarily focused on one geography, especially cyber criminals. And any organization globally can fall victim to an attack, of course. In terms of Asia edging out other geographies last year, the Olympics in Japan could have played a part, as we do traditionally see threat actors tailor their targeting based on contemporary events. That's why when there are certain events like an election or a worldwide sporting event or a conflict or war, organizations in the impacted region or industry should be on heightened alert and use threat intelligence to inform their risk mitigation strategies. I don't know that there's been enough time that's elapsed this year to determine the most targeted geography for 2022, but given the war, it is possible that Europe edges out the other geographies this year, especially if it continues well into this year. Next slide. So given today's audience, I did want to focus on North America and the trends we saw in this region. No surprise that ransomware led as the top attack type on North America, since it was the top attack type globally. But what is notable is that it made up 30% of all attacks in this region, whereas in Asia, for instance, it only made up 11%. And in other regions as well, to include Europe and Middle East and Africa, it was notably less impacting as it was in North America. Business email compromise attacks was the second most attack type in North America, making up 12%. This again suggests that BEC attackers are going after organizations that have not implemented multi-factor authentication. Phishing was the #1 initial infection vector, and again, at 47%, this is higher than in other regions that we saw where, say, vulnerability exploitation was most often seen, as in Europe and the Middle East and Africa. And then, as I just noted, manufacturing was the top attacked industry. And we'll actually talk a little bit more about industry trends on the next slide. Manufacturing, while we did find it to be the most targeted, it was by a very small margin. Looks to be about 1%. So despite that, this is a big deal for financial services to drop to number 2 after nearly 5 years at the top. And we do attribute this in part to the great strides that they've made in terms of their defensive security posture and resilience to attacks. And they really do continue to be sort of a forefront in this space. And threat actors may not be getting enough traction with financial services organizations as maybe they have in the past. And so they're turning to other industries. And of course, they've been going after manufacturing and other industries within the supply chain space. And a lot of this has to do with, attackers are looking to target organizations that are under enormous pressure to avoid downtime, and the ones that may be more inclined to pay out to resume their operations. And of course, as I mentioned, supply chain issues continue to plague organizations this year. So we do anticipate this industry to continue to be a high value target for attackers. Then another interesting industry trend that I wanted to call out has to do with the retail and wholesale industry. So typically, we see this driven by attackers targeting mostly retail organizations, but this past year, we actually saw sort of a flip here where there were more organizations in the wholesale industry that was targeted, again, largely attributed to their role that they play in the supply chain. So the overarching theme here is that threat actors are reviewing the landscape and they're adjusting their targeting to glean the best return on investment, which is why we review the threat landscape so that we can also better position ourselves and efforts from a defense perspective. Next slide. So then, speaking of our efforts and based on the findings that we have in this report and that I've shared, there are several key recommendations. The first on the list should be no surprise, it's to have a response plan to ransomware. This attack type, it spanned all industries, all geographies, and one important piece of this plan is to include immutable backups so that you can recover data. Another important point is to drill this plan so that it becomes part of your team's muscle memory. The time to review the plan is not during a crisis. You would just lose valuable time, and updating the plan while you're trying to address an incident also isn't feasible. We have a great resource. It's called the Definitive Guide to Ransomware, Readiness, Response, and Remediation. We published it at the end of 2020, but it's still very much relevant, and we're actually looking to refresh it and publish it back out in the coming months. Number 2 on this list here, it's no surprise, I've mentioned it several times throughout the discussion, it's the implementation of multi-factor authentication. We've actually seen this help mitigate against ransomware, business email compromise, and other types of attacks. And I have this great anecdote that I always share. A couple of years ago, X-Force published analysis of an Iranian threat group who we found actually released hours of training videos, basically showing how they conduct their account takeover operations. And what it showed, however, as they came up against a site that used MFA, they basically moved on. So it acted as a deterrent. So can MFA be circumvented? Yes, but these cases are fewer and far between, and in many cases require time and effort and social engineering to accomplish, which attackers may not achieve. So definitely enabling MFA continues to be a strong recommendation. The next recommendation, we already talked about this layered approach to phishing, right? So we saw phishing quite frequently be very successful. So that's combining the phone call with the email, multiple touch points along the way. So we need to have multiple defense mechanisms against phishing as well. So updating end user education to be relevant with the latest phishing campaigns that we're seeing, as well as email security solutions that sort of filter out those malicious messages. In terms of exploitation of vulnerabilities, that was the second most seen infection vector. So it's very important to decrease the opportunities that attackers have to exploit those vulnerabilities by maturing your vulnerability management system. Another recommendation is to adopt a zero trust strategy or approach. And one key component of this, of course, is to limit privileges. But there's many other things that make up this paradigm, so it's important to try to understand what that strategy entails. We've also seen a positive correlation between a shorter length of an incident and the overall cost of an incident. So having a platform that drastically speeds up your ability to respond to an incident can lower cost. And then finally, having XDR means you have more visibility into your environment and ability to respond quickly, and therefore, of course, reduce your costs. Next slide. So I'd like to end on this slide because it's a good overview of the main points that I've shared and trends from the report. So if there's anything I can circle back on or highlight further, please let me know. Otherwise, I appreciate everyone's time today.
Well, thank you so very much, Michelle. Very insightful comments. A little bit scary and sobering at the same time, but I think some of the recommendations and these key findings will be useful for all of us. So that is very much appreciated. I should say this presentation is available to everyone who's on the call today and does include the following slides as well, that are some links to some additional IBM resources that could further enhance the discussion that Michelle started us with here. So again, if I could remind everyone to, we'll break for a question and answer session shortly, but do feel free to add things to the chat here as well if you like. I would just like to turn attention now to, in partnership with IBM, a couple of next steps that potentially you attendees would be eligible for, to take advantage of, to help you weather the storm of ransomware attacks and such. These are loosely based against the NIST framework, which I'll describe in the next chart, really against best practices for cyber resiliency. So there's two. The first one is the ransomware risk framing workshop that we're teaming with the IBM security team on, and then the IT infrastructure cyber resiliency assessment, which we're working with the IBM storage group on. Just to go a little bit into that. So again, NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, have developed a cybersecurity framework function description that suggests the requirements to be helping identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover from cybersecurity threats and challenges. The first one, as I was mentioning, is the IBM Ransomware Risk Framing Workshop, and it identifies itself more against the first two, being the identification and protect function of the NIST framework. This is an interactive whiteboarding session that can be done in person or virtually. And through discussions and topics such as ransomware threats and vulnerabilities, compliance requirements, identity and access management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, this whiteboard and discussion results in a summary report generated after the session to help provide some guidance, some personalized next steps, and ways to further protect oneself in these situations. Secondly, is a cyber resiliency assessment tool, and it focuses more on the last three sections of the NIST framework, being the detect, respond, and recover. And the attitude there is, although you will try and identify and protect yourself as best you can, it perhaps is not a question of if you will be breached at some point, but more a question of when. So it is assuming that there has been a breach, and how do we recover from that? So in this case, and as I said, yes, so we're working on the detect, respond, and recover parts of the NIST framework in this case. Again, this one is through a interactive questionnaire session where answers are provided, and in the end, a deliverable report a week or so later will come back, understanding your own ranking within other customers within your own industry and such that have taken this study, and comes out with recommendations and whatnot. And I should say this particular one is extremely useful. R2I, as I said, we are a public, private, and hybrid cloud provider. So we did run this cyber resiliency assessment tool on ourselves. And although I think we fared fairly well, we did find it extremely insightful and a very valuable tool. So again, both the crack tool and the risk framework workshops are available to those who have attended. And we would ask if you could perhaps connect to your R2I or IBM security or IBM storage representative for further information and how to proceed further. I'd also suggest that for those who would like to re-listen to this broadcast or have colleagues who might be interested in listening, this webinar will be posted on the R2I resources page in the coming week. And lastly, again with the IBM security team or the IBM storage team, we will be delighted to have personalized sessions for you where we can specifically work with you on your particular requirements and help in your specific and unique situation. So with that, I think we're at the point now where we are opening up everything for questions, comments, discussions, if anyone has any. So I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but you are welcome. I think Kim can unmic you if anyone would like to ask a question, either on the chat line or in person. Kim, any special instructions, Kim, for anyone who would like to ask a question?
Yes, you do. Just have in the panel, there's a raise hand at the bottom of your screen. So if you wish to ask a question, just click on raise hand and I will be happy to open your microphone. Otherwise, you can always use the chat. You can send me a private message or ask to everyone at the same time.
All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. That shows you did an excellent job, Michelle, of covering off the information completely. And again, also we'll send out in our follow-up email to everyone, we'll send a link to the X-Force report itself, so that you can what Michelle has summarized for us today. You are welcome to review the entire report in detail, if you wish. Let's see, what do we have? I was looking at the chat. It's actually from Kim. Well, no, I think that's great. I think it looks like Michelle, you've done an excellent job of covering all the bases. So on behalf of R2I and IBM, I would like to thank you very, very much for your participation today. I'd also like to thank, of course, everyone for joining us. And I think all agreeing that a very, very insightful comments to a very top of mind topic that we're all wrestling with these days. So with that, I would just like to thank everyone for their time today. We look forward to continuing our conversations with you, and we'd like to wish you a great day. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.